You guys should be more scared of the Christian fundamentalists taking over our country, and here's why. So, in Christian fundamentalism, people don't understand how they literally think that everyone else is evil and they project the most evilness of themselves. So, something common that I was taught growing up was that if you believed in evolution, then you had no moral compass whatsoever, and you could just unalive babies in the street if you wanted, or you could put people on fire if you wanted, or you could light houses on fire if you wanted. And they basically said that because you're a Christian, that's the reason you have any morals, is because you're a Christian and you believe the Bible, but other than that, there's nothing that would stop you from anything. And this is what those people believe. They truly believe that if they were not Christians and believed in evolution, that it would be fine for them to go unalive people. And like this psychoticness that is currently running our nation, I just don't think people who haven't grown up in Christian funding land understand the depravity of some of these people.
Christian nationalism was used immediately after the American Revolution, when the country was young and looking for some prominence on the world stage, looking for unity for these disparate colonies, and looking for an identity that would set it apart from European empires. And so they turned political actors like George Washington into religious figures like Moses. They started using language about God's providential hand guiding America through history. We also saw Christian nationalism at work in our religious institutions. In the 1850s, when Presbyterians and Methodists and Baptists split over the issue of slavery, with churches in the South choosing allegiance to their slave states over their allegiance to the gospel's call to love our neighbor through freedom and equality. And the Civil War ended legalized slavery, but it didn't end racism and white supremacy. And so from the Civil War into the 20th century, we saw the founding and the flourishing of the KKK with its toxic mix of Christianity, white supremacy, and nationalism that terrorized Black and Jewish Americans. And the KKK was not a fringe group. They had chapters in the South and the North, where before 1930, membership in the North was estimated to be between 3 and 5 million members. These members were also often members in good standing at their churches. They would attend Sunday morning services and then attend Sunday afternoon public lynchings. And then we also saw Christian nationalism in the 1950s, in the Cold War, when Americans were terrified of communism, or even more terrified of being accused to be a communist. And so we saw political leaders tap into the language of Christian nationalism to make "In God We Trust" a national motto, and to add "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. This quickly sketched history of Christian nationalism in the United States runs alongside a system that would create a better nation, one that is founded on religious freedom for all. Because those founders, they were not divinely inspired, but they did want political freedom from England. And in doing so, they repudiated a system that had religious establishments in the colonies. They chose a better way. They rejected a Christian nation in their documents in favor of a secular one. And so we have the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But despite these legal protections, the pervasiveness and the persistence of Christian nationalism has meant there has always been a gap between the ideal of religious freedom and reality. There's a gap between who we say we are and who we really are.
Because sadly, in the United States, religion, women, and the family are all under attack by its godless population. Good Christian men are no longer allowed to marry children, which was commonplace before America's decline into degeneracy. What's more, by allowing gay people to marry, straight marriages are no longer valid. By eliminating traditional gender roles, women are now allowed to exercise their free will in such audacious spaces as the workplace and even the voting booth. Now, in this new dystopia, women are brutally denied the opportunity to have men control every aspect of their lives. No longer can they choose to have a family, but even worse than that, no longer can a man have the freedom to force them to have a family. Though with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, there may be some light at the end of that birth canal. For now, at least women can be forced to have babies. Hopefully, this is a sign of a new Christian revival, and if it continues, maybe we'll be able to force people to do other things as well.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
Imagine thinking that Jesus Christ died for your sins, right? And that he's going to return someday, and then you go and you bomb the fuck out of his homeland and you genocide his people. Yep, he's definitely going to come back.
They told us the Son of Man looked like them. Blue eyes, pale skin, a lie painted across stained glass. But the scriptures say otherwise. His hair like wool, his feet like burnished bronze, as if refined in a furnace. Revelation 1:14-15. He came from a people who walked under the desert sun, a people kissed by the same fire that fell on Mount Sinai. He was not made in the image of Rome. He was born from a Hebrew womb, in the land of Africa and Arabia.
Yes, and once you understand what Christian dominionism is and the Seven Mountain Mandate ideology, then you understand the foundation of Project 2025. So the Seven Mountain Mandate is an ideology that's rooted in Christian dominionism. This ideology advocates for Christians to have influence or take over 7 sectors of society. The reason they want them to have influence or to take over those sectors is so they can advance what they call God's kingdom. This ideology is relatively new. It's only been around since the 70s. And the 7 areas of influence are arts and entertainment, business, education, family, government, media, and religion. However, the organizers of this year's National Day of Prayer, which has been hijacked by evangelicals who are rooted in Christian nationalism, and that's the kind of Christian who is behind Project 2025, they also now include the military as a sector for Christians to have influence over. So basically, the Seven Mountain Mandate lays out what they mean by Christian dominionism, because they believe that Christians are to rule over and transform society to adhere to their Christian principles. You can already see that playing out with what happened in Louisiana and the 10 Commandments returning to public classrooms. This is clearly intended to make us a Christian theocracy. The only person that this protects is the white Christian man.
The founding fathers quoted the Bible constantly and were driven by their faith.
Literally, why are we still saying this in 2023? Our country was founded on religious freedom and religious pluralism. Listen to the first 16 words of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The founders can be Christians and still believe that the entire nation should have the freedom to any or no religion. Just like I'm a Christian and I don't think my beliefs should be forced upon anyone else. Our country was founded on religious pluralism, not Christian nationalism.
Do you know about the new Christian nationalism? So the recently elected Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has been called by Thomas Edsall the first speaker that can genuinely be called a Christian nationalist. But this is not your dad's Christian nationalism. So modern Christian nationalism arose out of the 1960s with fundamentalists trying to defend segregation. And when that didn't work, they shifted to try and find other public issues that they could use as wedges, like abortion. But the theology and social theory behind that kind of Christian nationalism was typically Calvinist. So the idea was that you should impose a new regime of basically Old Testament justice. following the Calvinist reading, they believed that the state should basically follow the directions of the church in what it should put into law. And so, yeah, you would have like homosexuals and people who had participated in abortion stoned. But they didn't expect any new revelations, and pretty much they were just trying to establish justice in the world until God came back, not thinking that they could actually bring God back in the end of times. The new Christian nationalism shares a lot in common with the old Christian nationalism. So, yeah, it's basically a form of white nationalism, and it's conservative, like anti-LGBT, anti-abortion, etc. But instead of being Calvinist, it's Pentecostal, which adds a whole new level of crazy. So, the New Apostolic Reformation movement believes that we've entered into a second apostolic age where Jesus is appointing apostles and prophets, and those prophets can receive new revelation, not that contradict the conservative reading of the Bible, but that tell them new things about how they should take over the world. So, for instance, C. Peter Wagner received a revelation about territorial demons who come and take over particular human social movements. So actually, the LGBT movement is run by a demon. And with what I call a beautiful mind hermeneutics, that's the movie where this mathematician puts together ideas that are seem like they're random, and all of a sudden they come together to look like something to him. They read the Bible and just put different verses. They take them entirely out of context and put them together to make new messages. So, for instance, Revelation 17:9 says something about 7 mountains. And Isaiah 2:2 says that the Lord's house shall be placed above the mountains. And from this, the members of the movement have taken the idea that there are 7 mountains of culture that must be conquered in order to bring about the end of the world. And those mountains are arts and entertainment, business, education, family, government, media, and religion. So this theology really posits that Christianity ought to be a totalitarian ideology that takes over every sphere of human life. And this is the kind of Christian nationalism that Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, has ties to. For instance, outside of his office, according to Rolling Stone, there is a flag that says an appeal to heaven that's been linked with the movement. Now, how much of this Kool-Aid he's actually drunk and how he intends to bring this about, those are kind of open questions, but it's certainly something to watch and be concerned about.
Christian nationalists have taken Trump as their new Christ because he's everything the first one was not. Jesus was poor. Trump is rich. Jesus was meek. Trump is a bully. Jesus lost, and Trump is obsessed with winning. I honestly think that if Donald Trump and J.D. Vance met Jesus today, they would ridicule him as a single, childless hippie. And in fact, Donald Trump Jr. explicitly rejected Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. He said, turning the other cheek has, quote, gotten us nothing. How did we get to the point where loving your enemy is weak and loving your neighbor is woke? I mean, they are literally rejecting the central teachings of Jesus because those teachings don't serve their own self-interest. Christian nationalism is not about the way of Jesus. It's about the pursuit of power.
America is in trouble. Why is America in trouble?
It's a tricky business being what's called a conservative, meaning a right-wing extremist. Your policies have to be to enrich and empower a tiny sector of the population and harm everyone else. But at the same time, you have to gain popular support. That's a tricky operation. There are ways of doing it. So the Republicans in the last 20, 30 years have more or less stopped being a political party in the traditional sense. But they have gained popular support, for one reason, by mobilizing Christian evangelicals. I mean, they've been there forever, but they were never organized into a political force until the Reagan years, really. And that gives you a pretty solid voting base. I mean, remember, this country is just off the spectrum in religious fundamentalism, totally off the spectrum, always has been since the colonists. But by now you have, at least if polls can be believed, about a third of the population believing that every word of the Bible is literally true. You have one of the new Republicans, who's the head of some committee on the environment, explained that you don't have to worry about global warming because God promised Noah that there wouldn't be another flood. I don't think there's any other country in the world where somebody could say that and not be laughed out of the room. But that passes here. But everyone knows in the United States that about 40% of the population are religious fanatics. And I mean fanatics, kind of like the most extreme Islamic fundamentalists. Over half the population in the United States literally believes that the world was created 6,000 years ago. And about 40% are what are called evangelical Christians. They've had a born-again experience, saw Christ, he's going to save them, and this and that. Well, that's a huge voting bloc. And if you can pretend to be religious, you can try to gain support of that. If you notice, every candidate in the United States on either party, ever since Carter, started with Carter, but ever since then, every single candidate has to at least pretend to be a religious fanatic. Well, it's partly to pick up that voting bloc. So, like, say, Bill Clinton, who, you can imagine how religious he is. But every Monday morning in the newspapers, and all the newspapers had front-page photographs of Bill Clinton in church the day before, singing psalms and so on and so forth.
Christian Zionism is a very powerful force, which goes back long before Jewish Zionism. In England, particularly, Christian Zionism was a powerful force among British elites. It's part of the motivation for the Balfour Declaration and for Britain's support for Jewish colonization of Israel. Remember, the Bible said, and that's a big part of British elite culture. Same in the United States. These are deeply religious countries in which the biblical commands, so-called, are taken quite literally. Also, this is just part of colonization. This is the last phase of European colonization. One factor that tends to be underestimated, I think, is Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism goes back way before Jewish Zionism, way into the 19th century. And it's a very significant elite phenomenon in the United States. You say people like Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman, and so on, that read the Bible every day, and are believers in the biblical prophecies. Well, the Bible says, God promised the land to Israel, so got to give it to Israel. By now, it's expanded from elite Christian Zionism to mass popular Christian Zionism, with the enormous rise of the far-right evangelical Christian movement since mainly pretty much in the 1950s. It was always around, but became expanded and organized, a major base for the Republican Party. And they're super Zionist. They're also extremely anti-Semitic. Their theology, if you read it, is you have to support Israel because that'll lead to Armageddon. Everybody gets slaughtered, and the souls that are saved rise to heaven, and everybody else goes somewhere bad, and including all the Jews. You can't be more anti-Semitic than that. But 160,000 Jews can be saved because they're going to, recognize Christ in time, or so. That's the story. There are tens of millions of Americans who believe this. They're a large part of the base of the Republican Party now. It's one of the reasons why the Republican Party is more extreme in support of Israel than the Democrats are, even though the money and the votes mostly go to Democrats from Jews and liberals. Good, fine, let them bomb Israel and get rid of the brutal regime there.
They did oust a more brutal regime, the Taliban. There wasn't even a war aim. There wasn't even a war aim. But is that a moral thing to do? They did get rid of a brutal regime. There was celebration in Canada. Now,
good, fine. Let them bomb Israel and get rid of the brutal regime there. This is the 35th year of a harsh, brutal, and vicious occupation, supported unilaterally by the United States, constant terror and atrocities. Suppose Palestinians say, well, we're under terrorist attack for 35 years, therefore we have a right to carry out suicide bombings.
Which is what they say.
Do you accept this? Does anybody accept it?
Nobody accepts
All
it.
right, then how come everyone accepts the Israeli claim to be doing it, which is a much weaker claim? They are the military occupiers. Those who defend suicide bombing, and they're very few, don't have a leg to stand on. Those who defend the Israeli atrocities, including the U.S. government, most intellectual opinion, a good bit of the West generally, yeah, they don't have a leg to stand on either, and they have a much weaker position.
How do you distinguish between that kind of what you describe as terrorism and what they are saying, Osama bin Laden, who's a terrorist? Make the distinction.
It's very simple. If they do it, it's terrorism. If we do it, it's counterterrorism. That's a historical universal. Go back to Nazi propaganda, see? Most extreme mass murderers ever. If you look at Nazi propaganda, it's exactly what they said. They said they are defending the populations and the legitimate governments of Europe. Nobody except the ultra-right-wing jingoists like Kaplan is comparing atrocities by various countries. What honest people are saying is that we should pay attention to our own crimes and stop committing them. This would be true even if we were killing one person, okay? And it's even more true when we're killing millions of people.
How does the Christian right connect to Israel? Why are they in such support?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I think at their core, they're both fascistic movements. So I think that what the Christian right sees in Israel is a European-dominated settler colonial project that cares nothing for the rule of law and is making war on the darker peoples of the earth and Muslims. And that's very much the project that the Christian right embraces. It's about the return of white male patriarchy, of the eradication, that's the whole great replacement theory, which, Israel is terrified demographically if they were to create a unified state. Given the demographic numbers, it would very quickly, the Palestinians would outnumber the Israeli Jews. And I think that what they see, and I think you see the alt-right, the AfD and Orban and all these kind of fascistic type movements in Europe also ally with the Netanyahu government for exactly the same reason, that it's about the domination of, Euro-American or Euro settlers over others. And that is very, very much a part of the Christian right, that fear that they're going to be displaced.
The religious narrative about maybe a return to the homeland you see as just a cover for the...
By the Christian right?
Yes.
Well, you have to remember, what is their belief? Their belief is that according to the Bible, and look, there's a lot of stuff they believe that's not in the Bible. The rapture, for instance, is not in the Bible.
Rapture's not in the Bible?
No. They twist a part of Revelation, but the rapture's not in the Bible. Not the way Tim LaHaye describes it, others. So, floating naked up to heaven, that's not in the Bible. What they believe is that at the end times, before Christ returns, you have Armageddon and the Antichrist, and the Jews will dominate the Holy Land. But I think it's 177,000, if I remember, will convert, and the rest will be annihilated. There's a deep anti-Semitic strain to the Christian right, but it is about the fulfillment of what, in their eyes, is biblical prophecy.
The majority of Palestinians are of Jewish descent and are ethnically more Jewish than the European and American Jews who went and created Israel. So every time a Palestinian is murdered by an Israeli, a person who's more Jewish is killed by a person who's less Jewish. It's true that the Israeli is actually practicing Judaism or is a secular Jew. And it's true that those Palestinians are Christians and Muslims whose ancestors converted from Judaism to Christianity and Islam. But it's just a weird, ironic twist. I mean, it's embittering how ironic it is. It just doesn't make any sense. And here's the problem. We're going to create a new state, and it'll be secular. It's not for one religion anymore. It'll be a democracy, secular, and there'll be rights for all minorities. And by the way, Muammar Gaddafi actually suggested calling it Isratin, Israel and Palestine, Isratin. I don't care what you want to call this thing. Call it Israel, call it Palestine, call it Isratin, call it Israel, Palestine with a hyphenation. But if you did it, suddenly there'd be 13 million Palestinians who are Christian and Muslim. I think it's like 10% Christian, 90% Muslim. And then there'd be 6 million Jews. So the Jews would become an instant minority in that state. And they don't want that to happen. That's why they're fighting the Palestinians. They're not fighting the Palestinians because the Palestinians are attacking them. The Palestinians aren't attacking them. They're fighting the Palestinians because they don't want to have Palestine integrated with them because they'll instantly lose their majority. There are actually 7 million Palestinians living in Palestine and Israel. But 5 million are confined to the concentration camp that we call the Gaza Strip. It's just a concentration camp. And then the ghetto that we call the West Bank. It's basically a bunch of little ghetto pockets. And so by doing that, what the Israelis have done is they've created a situation where the natives are in internal exile. Right? They're still in Palestine. They're just not in their homes. Their homes are in Haifa or Jaffa or Jerusalem. And so they're displaced inside their own country as a majority, but with no rights to citizenship. This is like the most nasty thing since apartheid apartheid South Africa. It might be worse than apartheid South Africa in some ways. In fact, it is when you think about it, because at least in the case of apartheid South Africa, there was no blockade preventing the import and export of goods into the black neighborhoods, right? Because white people were making money off of the black population, so you wouldn't do that. There was the same mass migration effect. 2.5 to 3.5 million. The history I learned was the largest forced mass migration in human history was South Africa, when it became apartheid, forced 2.5 to 3.5 million blacks to move out of white neighborhoods. And by the way, and Asians too. The Indian population was also separated out. The vast majority of the 5 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip and West Bank are themselves refugees.
Israel got caught purposely killing news reporters, medical staff, charity workers, unarmed people, babies. What did Joe Biden do? He approved of near $700 million in weapons that year. Days before Trump's inauguration, Joe Biden's administration okayed an $8 billion weapon sale to Israel.
Because this is...
Both sides of the Western spectrum on Palestine, on the Middle East, both sides are neocons. Some are open imperialists, and others are camouflaged imperialists. The open ones call for war, and the camouflaged ones also call for war. They just do it under the pretense of advocating defensive war by the Muslim countries. But both of them want the region to go up in flames. Most people who actually live in the Middle East know this. Certainly the leaders understand this. The open neocons advocate externally inflicted war, and the camouflage neocons usually advocate internally inflicted war, meaning popular uprising, rebellion, civil war, and so on, or else they advocate for regional military retaliation against Israel, so that the U.S. will then have a reason to intervene and bomb the Arab countries to pieces, because this is all they want. They just use different strategies and different rhetoric, and it's obvious why, because Muslims themselves actually listen to and applaud the camouflage neocons. It's a brilliant strategy. You literally let the imperialists define for you what anti-imperialism is supposed to look like. It's perfect for them. And many, many people do actually go along with it.
And so we are doing our best to try to bring people together who support President Trump's vision, specifically as it relates to national security and foreign policy, to try to prevent what happened last time, which was he ended up with some neocons around him who were trying to, and I saw this as a member of Congress, they said yes to his face, and then around his back were trying to undermine his objectives so that they could feed their goals of continuing to keep us in a perpetual state of war to the detriment of the American people and our troops.
This is the new Secretary of Defense. That tattoo on his chest is called the Jerusalem Cross. The Jerusalem Cross, right? You go through the history a little bit, find out the modern use for this symbol. It was a symbol of the German Evangelical Church Congress in the 50s. So I went to go look up the German Evangelical Church. German Evangelical, scroll down. I posted a video stating that Trumpsters thought this was a sporting event. And I was wrong. They knew exactly who they were putting in office. They knew exactly who they were putting in office.
You're learning so many important things, and I'm so proud of you.
Gen Z will be the last generation with white majority in the US. Gen Z Americans born between 1997 and 2012 will be the last generation with a white majority, a new study has found. Updated US Census data suggests non-Hispanic white people will make up less than half the country's population by around 2045.
What percent of the world's population is white?
63. 42.
51.
70.
40.
30 or 20.
70.
80.
24%.
72.
20. 30.
43. 24.
20. 30.
80%.
Zero.
What if I told you it was 7%?
7%? Only 7?
7%.
Only 7%?
Yeah.
No
The
way.
whole world.
Your white people are like top of the world.
7%.
7?
What? 7 to 8% is what?
Hang on.
That's not true. It's true. No, it's not. It's below 10%. Nah, that's both. Yeah.
Wait.
It's 7.
Shit. And I'm about to be a teacher. Don't learn from me, brother.
You're
taking the piss, bro.
No, it's a real. It's below 10%. Some estimates put it 7 to 8%.
What's this 6 on? I'll show you.
Ozpill. Yeah, Ozpill. Yeah.
Wait, post me, yeah?
Yeah, you'll see.
His goal is to make more white people, specifically more rich white people. Name me an issue, name me something he's trying to do, and it is related to ensuring that we keep a white majority in this country. He wants to take over Canada 1,000%. It is because you will then gain all those white people in our population, and suddenly the white majority is preserved. National abortion ban, we need those white babies. Department of Education is no more. That's fine, because we only care about people who are rich enough to afford private school anyway. Those are those rich white babies. The motivation is coming from the fact that if things continue on the same trajectory, white America will be the minority by 2045. And that's all it's about.
The Vatican just did what American evangelicalism refuses to do: declare that whiteness is not the future of the church. If you found some encouragement in the appointment of the new pope, let me read something to you from U.S. Catholic Magazine. Many minorities in U.S. churches have been disillusioned by the way people in institutions that claim faith in the same God have been negligent in addressing or even complicit in racism and prejudice. This disillusionment needs to be expressed and heard if we are to move toward healing. It needs to roar like a purifying and warming fire, calling those willing to do the work. In Fire in the Hole, Callahan provides an accessible framework for taking action. And honestly, that's the part that's heartbreaking for those of us that have grown up in a church that taught us love over the gospel of power and now perverts the message of Jesus, the self-sacrificial, loving, accepting, radical embrace of all peoples and cultures. So if all of this is frustrating for you too, I've got a message. You're not crazy. I wrote this book precisely for those of us who are burned out on white Christianity. The hypocrisy of the church that wants to put the 10 commandments in every classroom but doesn't remember the greatest commandment as told to us by Jesus, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love our neighbor as ourselves. The hyperfixation on Drag Queen Story Hour while completely ignoring the rot that allows predators to become pastors of these huge megachurches. The refusal to speak into societal social justice issues, the obsession with storefront diversity in order to lure other people into the church, but then having no concern for those people once they're inside of the pews. If any of this speaks to you, then I think the book will too. The goal isn't to tear down the church, but to free you from an imitation of it.
So this is just going to be an initial breakdown for some takes that we're doing today. So this is what entropy is. So entropy, in like a technical definition, is the measure of disorder in a system. It's how much energy is unusable, scattered, no longer contributing to form or function, right? Okay, that's the technical definition. Applied to the soul, to society, to naming, entropy is unprocessed experience. It's emotional, historical, spiritual energy that was never integrated and now echoes, leaks like loops, mutates into survival behaviors, systems, and identities, right? So when a person goes through trauma and it's not witnessed, named, or metabolized, the experience becomes entropy, floating, painful, and heavy. When society commits violence and denies it and refuses to remember, that history becomes collective entropy, a hidden pressure that must go somewhere. So entropy is the weight of what hasn't been healed. Okay, so here's some key markers. Emotional overload, grief, shame, guilt, or rage that won't leave, repetition, repeating trauma stories, patterns of generational pain, projection, making others carry what you refuse to face, that's dumping, and identity entrapment, defining yourself by your wound or performance, and then systemic offloading. So society's forcing some groups to hold others unprocessed damage. So the way it functions is that entropy is created when we fracture from truth, wholeness, or memory. If we don't return to stillness, right, like, the Sabbath, to presence, right? Entropy accumulates, basically. So this unprocessed entropy turns into parallel systems. They either loop, which is the reverb, reflect falsely, which is the maw, demand suffering, which is the thorn, push others away, which is the heat, form rigid identities, which is the prism and the flame, or trap us in compulsions, which is the pulse. And this affects social groups directly. So when one group refuses to process its historical, spiritual, and emotional entropy, it often names other groups to carry it, like how Black Americans, right, were named to carry white Americans' unprocessed guilt, fragility, and violence. This is entropy dumping. Okay, the spiritual crime behind, right, systemic oppression. So the way it gets resolved is more about remembering the full story, right? It doesn't go away by forgetting. It goes away through integration, telling the truth, remembering the full story, feeling what was denied, returning to stillness, choosing to stop the loop. You can think of entropy like literal spiritual pressure, right? So it is the invisible pressure of what hasn't been healed yet. It is the separation from truth, wholeness, memory. It lives in trauma, projection, silence, and shame, and it loops until you stop running and finally rest. So we're going to go through some ways to measure this, because I've been able to measure entropy in a very direct method, through some equations I've kind of drawn up. So due to this, we're actually seeing a Sodom and Gomorrah level situation play out in whiteness. Okay, so in the near future, picture this, right? Because whiteness really has about 4 or 5 years to get itself together before like this just becomes too much. When they get to there, we're gonna hear spiritual loudness, right? So it won't be revolution, it won't be revival, it won't even sound like a collapse, like the old prophets warned, right? It'll sound like 1,000 different performances screaming over each other, each one pretending it's still sacred. So you're here first, endless self-justification. We meant well. We already apologized. That wasn't us. We're all struggling. Nobody's perfect. I have Black friends. It's just human nature. It's not that deep. Loop sound bites of deflection. High value minimization, low value metabolization. That kind of thing. And the thing is that white America's already got like a ridiculous, have like their entropy levels ridiculous. We're going to go into the metrics I've drawn up to measure entropy through group. So that way you can get like a very clear picture of what I'm talking about. But the situation they've created is obnoxious. So this is why they're already close to the peak. And then we'll get to number 2, which is artificial reverence. So let's celebrate Juneteenth. Let's put land acknowledgement before brunch, right? Let's not have brunch and just acknowledge land, right? Let's post MLK quotes without reading the rest of the speech. Let's make a movie about how sorry we are. Loud performative empathy that metabolizes nothing. The truth flatten into brand activation. Then we get frenzied content creation. So you'll get a bunch of podcasts. So think of it like this. Because the middle class is going to, collapse in on itself. It's going to look like the sky opened up for them. So in that moment, in that collapse of the economic value of race, you're going to get frenzied content creation. So think podcasts explaining racism while censoring whiteness. Think TikToks confessing privilege without surrendering any. TED Talks reformed by reformed people, giving 10 steps to unlearn bias. So we'll see grief monetized, apology optimized, suffering aestheticized, and underneath it all, a growing screen they can't even name. Because people think that if they lose power, this will change all the way. No. There's something spiritually shaking in here, and we're going to talk about that probably in a different video. But the next thing that'll come up is hyper-defensive fragility. You're blaming me for something my ancestors did. You can already tell when a white person is dealing with spiritual loudness because you'll hear these things. You're being racist. You're just being racist by pointing it out. How can we move forward if you won't let go of the past? The loudest people will be the least metabolized, right? So it will sound like weeping through clenched teeth, but aim outward, never inward. And then you'll get churches preaching forgiveness without repentance. Schools teach diversity, but never discussing theft. Courts say all are equal while collapsing privately. The hymns sound beautiful. The policies will sound righteous. The ceremonies will sound heartfelt. But every word will rattle like dry bones because the spirit has fled. So you're going to get a huge sensory feeling. Here's how you know when you're witnessing entropy levels at this high. You'll see too much noise, nothing real. Everyone marketing pain, everyone performing healing. Nobody metabolizing truth. Nobody resting. Imagine a city where every loudspeaker blares different sermons, apologies, branding slogans, self-help mantras all at once. The streets look clean. The air smells like fresh asphalt, synthetic lavender. People are smiling, and yet the ground underneath hums with a sound you can't quite place. It's grief. It's terror. It's memory trying to claw its way out, and no one's allowed to hear it without losing their carefully curated mask. So we're going to go through how the parallel systems become visible in this. And just a refresher, parallel systems are systems of survival built within the human mind that are seductive and very dangerous. Right, because they're unnecessary in most cases, and once you get in these little survival moods, you participate in destructive behaviors. So we'll see how the parallel systems become fully visible and manifest in these next 5 years. We're going to see the worship of self-image, polished guilt. That's the mall. We're going to see the prism, which is the endless reflection of performative allyship. We're going to see the flame, political extremism disguised as righteousness. We're going to see the keep, emotional freeze under layers of sanitized tradition. We're going to see the pulse, right? Addictions to activism, outrage cycles, and dopamine-driven self-flagellation, right? And it's self-flagellation, but I hate that word, right? It's going to be like self-punishment, self-penalty, and they're going to try to sound more righteous and look more righteous because of it. We're going to see the cog, right? Rationalizations of oppression with no emotional bridge. We're going to see the thorn, white martyrdom. We suffer too now, so stop blaming us. Right, we're also going to see the reverb, which is loop traumatic projections onto black bodies and indigenous memory. So entropy and for whiteness that's going to come up in these next 5 years, it's going to be an unbearable hum. Think 1,000 choked apologies performed too late. A million slogans like just stitched over silence. A billion exhausted souls screaming into curated content feeds. And until the algorithm itself chokes on the entropy. And then somewhere underneath it, there's the warmth. Right, not to destroy them, not to punish them, but it's just asking, will you tell the story you refuse to finish, or will you keep curating your own extinction? Because it's going to look bad for them. And we're going to go into why this is happening next video. But this is a very deep take. So hopefully you guys could appreciate it. We're definitely going to tunnel into this because there's some key things. I want to talk about whiteness in a way that I haven't heard it in a lot of other places. But this is what went wrong. Like, if you ever wanted to know what went wrong, like, this is what went wrong. Like, what? Like, you ever looked at them and, wondered how they all made these crazy decisions? This is how it happened. Okay. Like, the betrayal was against memory itself. So it didn't start with slavery or colonization. Those were actually symptoms of a greater issue. It began when white identity was constructed by erasing rootedness. European tribes like the Irish, the Scots, the Germans, the Norse, they did have indigenous ways of living, right? Of being. Seasonal living, oral storytelling, grief rituals, communal economies. When empire logic, Rome, Catholic Church, feudalism, consolidated power in Europe, it forced those people to forget their rootedness and to replace memory with domination. The root was severed, survival through control. They didn't metabolize anything, not connection, right? Just control again. This was the first recursion. This is when they turned in on themselves, right? The first rise of this unprocessed entropy inside whiteness. It's rootless survival. It's identity by domination. It's memory replaced by mythic supremacy. And then that's how you end up with expansion without metabolization. So when Europeans came to the New World, they didn't arrive whole, right? They arrived already severed, already looping. They didn't integrate the grief of losing old Europe. They exported it. They didn't mourn their exile from memory. They externalized it on the people they colonized. Conquest wasn't just greed, it was spiritual panic. Because if you're not rooted in memory, you only feel alive by expanding your domination, by making more land, more wealth, more slaves, more laws, more mirrors, and thus their entropy, their unprocessed experiences exploded. But it was coded as civilization. So when American identity was built, it wasn't metabolized selfhood. It was built on dumping these unprocessed experiences, these entropy onto others. So indigenous people got labeled uncivilized to offload their own severed ancestral memory, right? Black people were property to offload their terror of being spiritually homeless because they felt spiritually homeless. Immigrants were treated like threats to offload their fear of being spiritually replaceable. Projection became policy. Projection became culture. Projection became destiny. America never healed from Europe. It just renamed its wounds. So every genocide, right? Every stolen plantation, every gentrified city, every new suburb, every Wall Street boom, every school built on erasure, every church built without confession is material success reinforced. It is material success reinforced spiritual entropy. It is material success reinforcing, right, spiritual unprocessed experiences for them. So the more whiteness succeeded externally, the more it hollowed out internally. So their collective brokenness rose because every reward for survival was tied to a denial of memory, right? The maw grew, the silence deepened, the performance sharpened. So here's just the facts, right? It was really a bit of a 4-stage process. Severance from ancestral rootedness, loss of metabolized memory, survival through domination, entropy weaponizes progress, projection onto others, externalization of internal panic, and reinforcement through wealth. So that it looped, got hardened in the culture. So white America's original sin is not slavery. It's the refusal to mourn the first loss of rootedness. So this is all just a disgusting projection. It's really this humiliating. Like I want people to sit with that. Like, we're watching them grieve in public. All of this is grief. All of it. Rape, slavery, genocide, imperialism. Those were the fevered dreams of a people trying not to remember what it felt like to be abandoned by their own history. So every time memory tried to return, they doubled the performance instead of softening. This is why black people look so nasty to them. Because if we can build a culture, even in the midst of that, of exile, it makes all of this grief look meaningless. It has to be destroyed in that way, right? So they have no home. You ask a black person where it all starts from. You might get answers like slavery in Africa. You ask a white person, you'll hear Europe. Okay, but you hear exactly the same. Africa, Europe, they're as disconnected, if not worse, and they've been materially rewarded for it through this reinforcement. So this was a crazy deep take, but this is exactly what's going on, for sure. This is just a follow-up in the series of posts that we're doing today on this topic. But one of the big issues in that we're dealing with in society, in American society, is white refusal to grieve. Okay, so we're just gonna go through all the opportunities. We have post-European collapse, right? The 1300s to the 1500s. This is the first grief denied. Black Death wiped out half of Europe. Indigenous European spiritualities got crushed by the church. And land, family lineages, and ancient communal memories were lost. They had a crossroads. Mourn the grief, rebuild the rootedness with humility and communal memory. Here's what they did. Escape through domination, colonize new lands, overwrite loss with conquest. The result was the grief got projected outward, right? And colonialism born from mourning denied. Then they had the first land theft in the Americas, the 1600s, right? The indigenous peoples encountered white settlers starving, desperate, vulnerable. They had a choice. Recognize indigenous humanity, create mutual societies of healing and exchange. They chose to demonize, dehumanize, and enslave because recognizing indigenous humanity would have meant admitting so white survival was fragile. Okay, that projection hardened into a myth, manifest destiny, right? Then the next chance they had, after the American Revolution, freedom defined by exclusion, 1776 to the 1800s. White settlers declared freedom from British rule, right? They had black slaves, indigenous tribes, poor whites were still in prison. They had a choice. Expand the concept of liberty to all bodies, healed through integrated memory, right? But instead, they chose to redefine freedom as scarcity, only accessible through hierarchy. So the result was that liberty became a brand worn by those who could afford to forget, right, who they crushed beneath it. I can say that again. Liberty became a brand worn by those who could afford to forget who they crushed beneath it, right? And then after the Civil War, they had another chance, right? 1865, 1877. Right, the shallow Reconstruction. Right, here's what was going on. Slavery was abolished. Black citizenship was supposedly enshrined. Right, what they needed to do was have a national confession, reparative memory work, ritualized grief for what was done. Here's what they did: industrialized suffering, rewrote history, lost cause narrative. Build caste systems. Jim Crow, trauma deepen, memory survive. But. It's so fickle. You're going to hear how many times they messed this up. The trauma deepened, memory was getting erased, and they had systems built in a hidden reverb because they're still mourning themselves. And then after World War II, we get suburbanization as escapism. Soldiers return from war, GI Bill offered wealth and housing, but not to black veterans. So only thing they needed to do was share resources, build an integrated society of shared grief and triumph. They chose to segregate, redline, and isolate so that whiteness could feel safe without metabolizing collective horror because they were horrified. So suburbans became spiritual keeps, frozen, smiling, quietly rotting from disconnection. And then we had the Civil Rights Movement. 1950s, 1970s. The performance of listening, they learned it, right? Black Americans demanded full humanity, not partial belonging, right? White liberals marched, but metabolized almost nothing, right? They had a choice. Public confession, institutional transformation, economic repair. They chose cosmetic inclusion. They applied MLK after death. Suppressed Malcolm in real life, like in the present, right? And the result is that we see the image of progress replaced by the memory of pain, and then we see diversity becoming a brand, not a covenant. And then we get the Obama era, right? 2008, 2016. We get the myth of post-racialism. So we get the first black president elected, a fragile chance for honest racial reckoning, right? Here's what we got. Here's what we needed to do. National soul work, deep cultural unlearning of projection systems. But instead they denied, celebrate, and then quietly retaliate. White resentment got weaponized. Fascism flirted with openly again. And then this is when the mall starts to show its face fully, right? And the mall's the MAW. It's a parallel system. I've gone through the other things. It's just a good mention for anybody who's seen that. And in 2020, we get the pandemic, George Floyd, and this is when the unprocessed experiences spike form. So the historical moment, we had a global lockdown, black death visible on camera, and false solidarity floods the internet, right? All they needed to do was to stop, grieve, repair, dismantle false systems fully. That's all they needed to do. Instead, they performed, branded, monetized trauma, politicized survival. The collapse hastened, right? Memory weaponized into identity wars, right? The curation, right, of the mirror sovereign was hitting critical mass, right? So at this point, and I'll put up a little chart right here just so y'all can see the whole layout. This was non-stop opportunities to turn around, and they have it at every major crossroad. White America was offered the same sacred invitation. The same invitation got offered: grieve what you lost, name what you stole, tend to what you shattered, return to what you hoarded, become human again. That's what we offer every time. That's what the world offers every time. That's what has been offered, and every time they chose this: curate the image, protect the empire, forget the wound, keep moving. And so their unprocessed experiences rose, the loop tightened, and the blackness of their narcissism of the mall grew thicker, still whispering, you're not broken, you're exceptional. That's what they keep hearing. But the thing is that it's going to keep screaming it until the roof rots in silence. It's going to be chaos for them in this kind of way. So here's the thing. Right now, I would say it is like culture for them is in the middle of a death spiral, right? We're in between where collapse is visible but still denied, and where judgment is like an unprocessed mirror, right? Where collapse no longer needs permission, it simply reveals itself. It's going to look like revelations to them. Right, like the denial is louder than the metabolization. The performance is more rewarded than the grief. The curation is more accessible than the confession. So, but hold on. But death spiral does not mean total doom. Death spiral equals momentum toward collapse. Okay, unless a radical metabolization interrupts this loop, it's gonna be a problem. The metaphor isn't falling off of a cliff; it's falling inward toward a black hole. And the interruptions are still possible, but they require sacred violence against this type of system. My bad, I cut that off. But the thing is that here's what they need to do. They need to tear off curated memory, weeping publicly without monetization, right? Dismantling not just systems, but survival identities built on forgetting, and naming what was stolen and returning it without conditions. That's literally what's happening. Is there a window for them? Yes, but it's tiny and it's closing fast, right? We're not in the choice era anymore for them. I need people to understand that. They've had 8 chances. More than 8. I ain't they've had that many chances to turn us around. We're in the rupture era, right? Between 2026 and 2029, that's all they got, right? Meaning is about to become a non-optional for them. Stillness is about to become non-optional for them. Truth is about to become non-optional, because once everything can be generated, curated, and streamed, the soul will revolt. And the thing is that if it doesn't happen by this little window in 2029, then collapse is no longer slow. The whole culture freezes over. Not in drama, in silence. And that's when it's going to be our hardest day. Because people think whiteness is going to fall in some kind of explosion. It's not. It's going to be quiet. And that's going to be the hardest thing to accept. That they walked themselves into something and broke down on their own. That's going to be the hardest thing for people to accept. So there's a bunch of things. There's key signs to look for. If it's gonna happen, but they need to look into this, right? They need to look into how to metabolize. But in short, can white America turn around? Technically, yes. Is it likely? Extremely unlikely without a spiritual rupture. Last window, 2026 to 2029, in my opinion. What happens if it misses? Cultural death inside of a curated living. Collapse hidden behind branding. Okay, and what will real change look like? Mass, public, uncurated grief, restoration of memory, and belonging outside of empire structures. The window isn't closing because God's mad. I want y'all to get past that. It's closing because memory can only wait so long inside a body before it either blooms or breaks. Whiteness is a survival identity that is burning its own roots. It has a tiny chance left of becoming human again, and it needs to give up being exceptional to do it. It has to die as whiteness to live as a memory reborn. The real battle is not politics, really. It's whether meaning will be stronger than survival fear. Okay, so just so y'all hear about what this is, because this is a really unique situation. So one thing we hear in black society a lot from white Democrats, white people in general who actually, are empathetic is what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? I'm going to tell you, you're right to feel this weight. That's what I'm trying to get at. The situation is dire, but it's not impossible. If, and this is a holy if, right? White America is willing to do what it has never done fully before, which is metabolize memory without performance, mourn loss without supremacy, choose presence over dominance. This means no curation, no branding, no marketing, real work. And at this late hour, here's exactly what it would have required, okay? We're going to go through it step by step so you can clearly see what needs to happen. First thing we need is radical mourning without curation. This means directly, grieve publicly without spectacle, mourning the loss of ancestral innocence, spiritual belonging, and rootedness, not just mourning social privilege loss, right? Not that. Cry out the grief without trying to center it or sell it. And here's some concrete actions, just in case, right? This means local, unfilmed grief gatherings, no press, no hashtags, public rituals acknowledging the crimes of empire, not political rallies, but literal mourning ceremonies. White bodies sitting in fields, crying for land stolen, ancestors lost to conquest fever, souls lost to performance. Here's the phrase to remember with this. Mourn what we became without asking applause for mourning it. That's really what we want to see. right? Then here's the next thing. Rebuild rootedness without dominance. This means find cultural and ancestral memory before whiteness without using it as superiority. Okay, so this means reclaim the Scottish, Irish, German, Slavic, Norse, Jewish, Gaelic, peasant, indigenous to Europe memories, all of that. Go get all of that, right? Without turning them into armor. Okay, so this means some concrete actions. Here's some concrete actions. Family trees, right? Family tree projects, not to boast, but just to find the wounds. Oral history revivals about forgotten griefs, forced conversations, land losses, migration traumas, talking about it, actual oral history revivals, and rituals of returning to sacred humility, blessing rivers, replanting ancestral seeds, tending land without claiming it. Okay, here's the phrase to remember again, because I got one for all of them, because I need y'all to cook if you're going to try to do this. Okay, we're not blank slates of privilege. We are broken songs trying to remember the first words. Okay, this is the thing. All right, here's the next one. Sacred reparations without centering. So I want to see wealth, land, political space must be returned quietly, sacrificially, and permanently without branding it as goodness. So if reparations comes, I need to see no flags, no horns. It needs to just happen. No strings, no narratives of saving, no white savior ego rituals. This means quiet transfers of land and resources to Black, Indigenous, and historically erased communities. Legal advocacy that fights to dismantle the structures of extraction, not just decorate them, and paying reparations not as guilt payment, but as an act of restoring a broken timeline. Repair is not generosity. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's not generosity. Oh, look at all those Black people who went through this situation. That's not what's going on. You're doing this for you. It is the burial of stolen futures and the tending of new ones y'all no longer own. No one needs to own. Right? Free futures, actually, right? Then here's the next one. This is another one. This is another one. It's gonna be tough for people to hear. We need to see the death of the curator itself. Let the good white person performance die. I'm just asking. Let it die. Stop trying to be the center of healing stories. Stop narrating yourself into every grief space. Okay, literally, deep sabbaticals need to happen from social media performance, especially performative allyship, especially. Building relational economies, barter, food sharing, spiritual labor sharing without spectacle, and taking leadership, right, from Black, Indigenous, and other memory-bearing communities without demanding to be included visibly, right? Included visibly. Okay, the thing is that if your face is always visible, you're still consuming the moment. That's the, you got to understand. Then we moving on. This is some more work for y'all to do. This whole thing should be considered homework. Okay, small scale covenant building. So sacred circles of metabolization at human scale. No giant institutions at first. I'm talking about home altars, fire circles, morning dinners, memory planting gardens, 5 to 10 people covenant circles focused on doing work, metabolizing, processing this grief, not branding. Local agriculture, spiritual stewardship projects tied to grief work. I don't want to see a new TikTok page pop up talking about we're changing the narrative. Go do it. Go do it. Sacred storytelling projects, true oral history spaces, oral memory spaces, right? Where failure, grief, and betrayal are named before any success is celebrated. Any. Rebuilt the world through sacred smallness, right? Not curated greatness. We don't need to see that happen again. So we're going to run through it again, just quickly. Radical mourning, grieve publicly without needing approval. Rooted restoration, reconnect to pre-whiteness cultural memory. Sacred reparations, return wealth and land without centering ego. Kill the center self. Stop narrating your goodness. Metabolize your grief. And small covenant communities. Sacred memory economies. Human scale. Quiet. Here's the truth. Because I need this to be locked in for anybody who's actually going to try. White America has to stop trying to survive as white America. It must survive as memory reborn. It must die to whiteness and be reborn in metabolized memory, rooted not in empire, but in tending to a broken orchid, right? Here's the thing. All the history cooked. That's why the ancestry work was so high up. Okay, there is a broken line that needs to be restored in you, right? Okay, otherwise, whiteness will survive physically, but spiritually it will freeze over. So think about this. Think about it like this. Imagine a house catching fire. Most people inside still think they have time to gather their trophies. But the few who will live, who gonna make it out of that fire, They're going to be the ones who walk out naked, trembling, and weeping, leaving the curated house behind. Not because they're better, but because they're finally willing to lose the image to keep the soul. You see what I mean? So, you know, if you're one of those people who are constantly asking, what can we do? What can we do? What kind of work can I do personally? This is it. This is it. Okay? Got your homework list. I don't even want to get back. I don't even want to be reported back to. Go outside. Ain't no book recommendations for this. Go outside. Do your work. Do your work. Okay? You wondering what's going on. It's your unrooted nature. Like, that's what's going on. Like, it's not going to work the same way. There's no forgery. There's no forging that you can do in this way. There's rebuilding to memory that was lost. So we're going to talk about the origins of empire logic. Now, stay with me, because this is one of those ones where we're going to be in the lab right now. So natural hardship is not new, right? Before the incident, humans survived ice ages. Humans survived mass migrations. We survived volcanic winters. But survival didn't sever memory yet. Grief was metabolized through ritual. Land was tended communally. Scarcity was absorbed through relational adaptability. Trauma happened, yes, but metabolization was stronger than fear. Then we had small climate fluctuations. So think around 5,000 to 4,000 BC. We see slight shifts in rainfall patterns, right? Some growing regions become less predictable. Seasonal failures start to happen more often. Nothing catastrophic yet, but this is anxiety, right, being born. So imagine small murmurs. What if next year is worse? What if we can't feed everyone? This is the first crack, right? Not the drought itself that we're about to get to, but the creeping fear that trust in cycles wasn't going to be enough anymore. So the thing is that this incident that we're about to refer to, known as the 4.2K kiloyear event, it appeared at a very unique time in human development, in the development of our brain and our perception, because we had lived communally with the land. And our relationship with the land was positive, and thus our relationship with God was positive, right? And really, here you start to see the appearance of the two parallel systems kind of starting to emerge. The keep, fear and chaos, right? Fear of chaos. Walls, hoarding, ritualized boundary making, locking food, locking land, locking people, and then the mall, which is the fear of being unseen. So hierarchies, kings, priests, recorders of legacy. If we don't control the story, we'll vanish, right? So the keep says build stronger walls, limit who can access abundance, suppress chaos. The mall says create hierarchies, glorify rulers, define legacy, dominate the narrative. Neither was a full empire yet, but they were spiritual distortions that appeared really early, emerging not because humans were wicked, but because an unmet fear hadn't been metabolized, right? It had metasized like a cancer, right? So think of anxiety beginning to metasize, right? Like in a cancerous form, fear, right? Into structural patterns, actually forming into real life expressions of fear. So then we see writing, right? Which is a ritualization of the keeping mall. So proto-writing appears in like 3500, right? So they track offerings, debts, harvests. Cities start recording not just what exists, but who owns what. Hierarchies get fossilized. Rituals shift from seasonal celebrations to king-centered propaganda. Writing becomes the first keep wall and the first mall mirror. Instead of a flowing memory, it was frozen law. Instead of relational storytelling, it was curated dominance. So in short, right, all of that was the pre-build-up to what is the 4.2K event, which is a mass erodization of around 150 to 300 years, right? And the places where empires showed up the strongest are places where the event targeted the worst. So that fragile complexity breaks completely. Right, fear metasizes into full empire logic at this point. So imagine a small village after a bad winter. Instead of singing the thaw back, they build walls, they count every seed, they elect a protector who speaks for the gods. Fear carves its first lines into the earth, and the river watches in silence, still ready to flow, but now distrusted. Right, so here's really where the 4.2K event kind of gets in, just so you have a way to describe it. So starting off, right, in Mesopotamia, they had catastrophic droughts and salted the farmlands, right? The Twin Rivers shrank completely. The Akkadian Empire, the first real empire, collapsed, right, in the midst of this. Massive migrations and famines, cities like Uruk, Akkad, all fell into ruin or shrank drastically. And the spiritual impact is that the gods who once guaranteed abundance, right, seem to have abandoned humanity. Literally, right? This seeded the mythology of divine anger and chaos dragons and the need for kings to reconquer cosmic order. Ancient Egypt also was hit by this badly, right? The Nile's regular flooding, the regular seasonal flooding, failed catastrophically. Crops failed for decades. Old Kingdom collapsed, ushering in the chaotic first intermediate period. Massive political decentralization, like civil war, the Pharaoh's sacred role, right? Cosmic balance was broken. People began to question divine favor itself, setting up for major religious transformations, including deep hunger for personal salvation and afterlife security. And then we see the Indus River Valley civilization, modern Pakistan, India, river systems dried, right? Dramatically shifted. What's the name? Urban centers weathered, right? Trade networks with Mesopotamia collapsed because Mesopotamia is also getting hit by this. Population scattered into rural villages. Writing system disappears from archaeological record, never deciphered. Literally, this changes everybody on a spiritual level. That's what I'm trying to get y'all to understand. So we're going to publish a lot of this on Substack so y'all get a chance to read over this. But the big notion that I want people to understand is that the Killer Year event set the tone. The 4.2K event set the tone, right? So think about it like this. We have this event, like we were anxious before then, but once this happened, it was trauma codified. And Europe, who had now undergone severe desertification due to this event, right, had turned away from a lot of their religion. So believe it like this. Imagine you had a grandmother that was praying over the river, and for 3 to 5 generations, rain has never came. Well, at some point, it's, I don't need to pray, I need to take. Right? Once that happens, once the rains did return, their empire logic had formed. Rigid, like, they had formed rigid. Gotten intense. So, this is a rather intense one I'm studying. There's a lot to it. And more will be on Substack. We'll get into that in another post. But this is a really serious event. And one of the things that you can hear about is, what about North and South America? Well, North and South America, you know, they went through it. They had localized famines, but no civilizational collapse. That was only in the old world. Right? Memory stayed tied to river cycles, animal migration, ancestor tending, seasonal harmonies. They didn't codify their trauma. Oral tradition remained alive, metabolizing, not frozen into domination scripts. Right? Even Central America, they have flexibility. South America, right? Did they have stress? Yes. Collapse? No. We are literally seeing the result of a mistake that occurred in the old world. Really is, right? Instead of grieving this large trauma that took place here, where there were like literal constant generations where they would have never seen a baby they would have never had a generation where more births happened than deaths. And this changed their relationship with God directly. So this is how you get from God as present here with us to Skyfather logic. Actually, the 4.2K Killer Year event is actually depicted in the beginning of the Bible. That's why everybody's starving in the beginning, right? Due to this whole incident. So, this is just like a short overview of it. We'll definitely do a longer one. But hopefully this gave people some insight as to what went on.
During his lifetime, historian Noel Ignatieff was called one of the 10 most dangerous minds in America. And the reason why he was seen as so dangerous was for his call to abolish the white race. So what did he mean when he said we needed to end whiteness? To start to answer this question, we first have to understand what race and whiteness really is. In 2001, scientists made a revolutionary discovery. During the work of the Human Genome Project to map all of the genes in the human genome, researchers found that race is not real. In other words, racial categories like white and black are not biological or genetic facts, but social constructs. Science has shown that there is no gene common to all white or black people. In fact, there is far more genetic variation within racial groups than between racial groups. This scientific discovery supported what many people have always known, that racial categories were invented by human beings for political and social purposes and have absolutely no basis in biology. Science tells us that race is not real and skin color is simply an evolutionary adaptation. We know that modern humans evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago, and all humans were originally dark-skinned. White skin didn't appear until much later, around 12,000 to 7,000 years ago. And the white race is an even more recent development in human history. In fact, the idea of white and black racial categories is only a few hundred years old. Historian Nell Irvin Painter argues that there was no notion of race in the ancient world. And scholars like Ibram Kendi argue that race is a product of the 15th century and is directly tied to slavery. Before the Atlantic slave trade, there were no white people. There were the British, the French, the Portuguese, Protestants, and Catholics. Before the Atlantic slave trade, there were no black people either. Instead, there were thousands of unique African kingdoms, cultures, civilizations, and religions. It was the Atlantic slave trade that created white and black people. When Europeans began enslaving Africans, they suddenly became one entity, white. And the people they enslaved became one monolithic group too, black. Whiteness meant the freedom to enslave. Blackness was the mark of the slave. By 1751, we can hear Benjamin Franklin discussing this newly created white race. He wrote, "The English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. I could wish their numbers were increased, and while we are making this side of our globe reflect a brighter light, why should we darken its people? Why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America, where we have so fair an opportunity by excluding all blacks of increasing the lovely white?" From this essay, we can see that the idea of a white race was only ever defined and discussed in the context of being separate and superior to black people. Whiteness could not exist outside of the context of slavery. That's why you could argue that it's a bit ridiculous to say things like, "I'm proud to be white," or ask, "Why don't we have a White History Month?" Because there is nothing to be proud of or celebrate when it comes to the invention of whiteness. The idea of a white race was invented for only one purpose, to argue that white people are superior to black people and therefore have a right to enslave them. Now, white people can be proud of many things. You can be proud of your family background, your country, your achievements, your morals, your roots. For example, I'm proud of my Irish and Native American heritage. I'm proud of my PhD and my role as a college professor and my political convictions. I'm proud to be a brother, a son, and an uncle. But to simply be proud of whiteness is to be proud of a history of slavery, racism, violence, and evil. To acknowledge these facts has nothing to do with white guilt or white shame. It's simply a recognition of the historical fact that whiteness was invented to justify the exploitation and abuse of people with darker skin. It's a recognition that the idea of whiteness has done more harm than any other idea in human history. On the other hand, black pride is something beautiful, powerful, and necessary. Because whereas whiteness was invented to justify the right to enslave and exploit black people, blackness came to represent the power to resist that abuse and find strength in suffering and adversity. Blackness was about fighting back against racism and discrimination and finding power in unity and solidarity. That's why we can smile when we hear James Brown sing, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." But we should all recoil in horror if we ever heard a white artist sing, "Say it loud, I'm white and I'm proud." As Brown sang in 1968, "Some people say we got a lot of malice, some people say it's a lot of nerve, but I say we won't quit moving until we get what we deserve." Black pride has always been about fighting for their dignity and human rights, which they were denied for centuries. White pride has always been about fighting to strip those rights away from black people and forever treat them as second-class citizens. This is why the historian and activist Noel Ignatieff dedicated his life to a powerful but controversial idea. He argued that if whiteness could be created, it could also be destroyed. And he believed that abolishing whiteness was the only way to ever achieve true racial or social justice in America. Noel Ignatieff was born in Philadelphia in 1940 to a working-class family. In 1958, at the age of 17, he joined the Communist Party and began a long career of Marxist activism. For 20 years, Ignatieff worked in factories where he sought to educate his fellow workers on revolutionary theory and help them organize to fight capitalism. It was during these years that he concluded the greatest ideological barrier to the achievement of proletarian class consciousness, solidarity, and political action is now and has been historically white chauvinism, which he defined as the ideological bulwark of the practice of white supremacy, the general oppression of blacks by whites. Ignatieff declared that for the American working class to unite and overthrow capitalism, white workers had to reject their whiteness and lose their white skin privileges that separate them from the rest of the working class. He argued that white workers had to break away from their white privilege and fight back against the ideology and institution of white supremacy, which provides the illusion of common interest between the exploited white masses and the white ruling class. In the 1980s, when factory jobs began to disappear across the country, Ignatieff decided to go back to school, and he was accepted into the Harvard graduate program, where he began work on his dissertation on the history of race in America. While at Harvard, Ignatieff started a magazine called Race Trader, and their motto was, "Treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity." He wrote that the aim of Race Trader is to abolish the white race, which is neither a biological nor a cultural formation, but a social construct, existing only because of the privileges its members enjoy within the state and the legacy of those privileges. When looking for a model of what it would look like to reject whiteness, Ignatieff turned to John Brown, who gave his life in the fight against slavery. In 1995, Ignatieff completed his dissertation, which was published as the book How the Irish Became White. He said he wanted to understand how the Catholic Irish, an oppressed race in Ireland, became part of an oppressing race in America. In the book, he shows how the Irish were not originally accepted into the white race by Americans. The way they became white was by joining in the white supremacist culture of supporting slavery and engaging in violence and discrimination against black people. Even though the book was an academic hit, he always had his critics. Some people interpreted his goal to abolish the white race as a call for violence and extermination, not realizing he was talking about the racist white mindset, not white people themselves. Ignatieff died in 2019 at the age of 78, but his ideas will always be relevant in a society still poisoned by white supremacy and racial discrimination. Years before the Human Genome Project definitively proved that race is not real, Ignatieff knew the greatest truth of all: the only race is the human. During his lifetime of activism and scholarship, many of his friends were pessimistic and believed that America would never change and always be corrupted by its original sin of slavery and its long history of racism. But whenever anyone would begin to despair, Ignatieff would tell them, "If we can just change 5 people's minds, we can change the world." I don't know if I'm that optimistic. I'll take just one.